Good afternoon. So, the fly sheet again, you've got all the quotations that I use in the course of the lecture. And these, to my mind, are the central quotations. So you can use the fly sheet for revision and to get an idea of what Aristotle is talking about. So you've had one or two examples of virtuous conduct from ancient Greek civilization so far this semester. For instance, Odysseus. In the Odyssey, we had the idea of moderation, the idea of something being well balanced between two extremes. In the Republic, which is the thing that immediately you'll be contrasting, and I'll make contrasts between Plato and Aristotle. In Plato's Republic, Plato gives an account of what goodness is in itself and why the lover of knowledge should strive to know what he calls the form of the good. But this is a very abstract notion of goodness, and the translation from knowledge of goodness to performance or action in a real-life situation is not obvious. The philosopher who's in charge of the state is supposed to be able to translate his knowledge of the form of the good into action. But Plato is not very clear about how this is done. So it's left to Aristotle to kind of systematize and go forwards from Plato. By way of background, three things should be grasped about what Aristotle meant by ethics. Firstly, ethics is part of the wider study of politics, since being good means both living well as a human being and being a good citizen. Secondly, both ethics and politics are what he calls practical sciences, as opposed to theoretical and productive sciences. I'm going to go into this a bit. And because they're practical sciences, they involve both action and feeling, which theoretical sciences don't. And thirdly, Aristotle's approach to ethics or morality differs from an approach in terms of uniform moral rules applicable at all times to all people, like commandments not to steal or never to lie. Because for him, acting virtuously differs from person to person and from one situation to another. To act well, a person has to know himself or herself, how he or she tends to respond in any given situation, and therefore to modify his or her action accordingly. I'm going to say a little bit about each of these three components. First, ethics is a part of politics. For Aristotle, quotes, "Man is by nature a social being." This means not only do we necessarily depend on others, as Plato had said, but more importantly, our characters are formed through training. First through socialization and education, then through practice. The social environment in which we live has an important effect on the way we think and act. But for Aristotle, the educational system is something that the state should be concerned with, and therefore legislation which fits into politics. Legislation is part of the business of making laws, and so this, according to him, is part of the business of politics, and therefore ethics comes within politics. Man becomes fully man in a community. The good of society is higher than the good of an individual. As he says, even if the good of the community coincides with that of the individual, it's clearly a greater and more perfect thing to achieve and preserve the good of the community. The Ethics, the book that out of which we're reading parts, ends by moving into the question of legislation, and that goes into the next book, his next book, which is called Politics. So that's the first thing. Ethics is part of politics. They also belong together because they're both, as I said, part of the practical sciences. Look, this is quite heavy stuff. So ethics and politics belong together because they're both part of practical sciences as opposed to theoretical and productive sciences. Theoretical sciences are things like philosophy, metaphysics, which concerns the essence of being, physics, which looks at objects from the point of view of their becoming. How do they change? And mathematics, whose objects of study are different from both beings and those things that change. This is just, so the three theoretical sciences are higher than both the practical sciences and the productive sciences because they involve pure reason, whereas the others involve feelings, both in making things, that's in production, and in doing things, moral and political action. In the theoretical sciences, man studies objects which he has had no part in creating. Their existence is external to man. In the productive and practical sciences, by contrast, it is man who creates something with his production or with his action. With production, as soon as you've produced something, it is apart from you. But with action, the action, in a sense, remains with you. As he says, production aims at an end other than itself. But this is impossible in the case of action because the end is merely doing well. With the practical sciences, the kind of knowledge required will be different from technical skill, which is what's required in production. Because there has to be a continual assessment in action of one's feelings and reactions, which is why I've called the lecture Actions and Reactions in Aiming at Happiness. How is this relevant to our reading? It's relevant in two ways. Firstly, in method, as he says at the beginning. You can't expect the same precision in practical sciences as in the other two classes of science. Quotes, we must be satisfied with a broad outline of the truth. The skill of a public speaker is not the same as the skill of a mathematician. In mathematics, you can get 100% in your quiz, but in the humanities, there's no way in which you can ever get to the depth of understanding that humanities requires. So it's really good to get 90%. It's not the same kind of skill, and it's not the same kind of thing that you're doing. Similarly, in the case of ethics, how to live a good life, there are, according to Aristotle, no hard and fast rules for everyone. Students vary in their potential. A teacher can't mold somebody made of stone. Aristotle says, therefore, our account of this science will be adequate if it achieves such clarity as the subject matter allows. I.e., first thing, it's about method. The second reason that Aristotle's division of the sciences into theoretical, practical, and productive is important to our reading is when he comes to assess the highest form of happiness, he says that it must resemble something that the gods do. Fulfillment for man must resemble something that the gods do. Reason for Aristotle, as for Plato, is in some sense divine. So using pure reason is closer to the activity of God than using practical reason or productive skills. The gods don't need to be involved either in production or in changing their character. Their activity as beings, they exist, can therefore only be a matter of turning inwards as pure contemplation, what he calls, in another work, thinking on thinking, pure contemplation. They can't be involved in production because to produce anything would be unworthy of God. And to be involved in moral action means that they would be improving their character, which contradicts the idea that they are perfect. So, as he says, if a living being is deprived of action and still further of production, what is left but contemplation? And therefore, among human activities, that which is most akin to God's will be the happiest. Man can't emulate the gods fully, for he has bodily needs. But in a sense, the highest form of activity for Aristotle is altogether beyond moral actions, which is most of what we're reading this week. It seems quite contradictory, but in trying to copy what gods or get closest to what gods do, he says the highest form of happiness is a form of contemplation. This doesn't mean that everybody in a city-state, according to Aristotle, goes around in a cloud of contemplation. On the contrary, most people are tied to social roles. But logically speaking, given Aristotle's premises, contemplation is the activity that most fully actualizes our potential as a rational being. Because reason is the highest thing in us, and so imitating what the gods do is the highest thing that we can do. So, from what I've said so far, you may be wondering what in practical terms Aristotle means by ethics. In a nutshell, ethics for Aristotle means training oneself to always do the right action with the right feeling in the right way. By doing this, one fulfills one's function as a human being. I'll come back to this. The idea of human beings have a particular function because they're different from animals and they're different from plants. What is the function of a human being? I'll come back to that. Yeah. So training, because circumstances change all the time, and each individual is different, such training calls for special alertness to react to each situation in the right way. It is this that makes a man virtuous, make somebody virtuous, by living well and acting well. So now we've got three distinctive features of Aristotle's ethics. I think we're now on item 4 of the flight sheet. First is his focus on virtues or excellences. A virtue is just an excellence. In Plato's Republic, you came across some, wisdom, courage, self-discipline, and justice. A philosopher should have all the virtues if he's going to be in charge of a state. But for Aristotle, one doesn't just have named virtues. Virtues are defined in relation to every field of activity. And some virtues in particular fields of activity don't have names. So a good man has to perform well in each field, whether the virtue in that field has a name or not. Secondly, there's an emphasis on training of character, as I've said. Aristotle uses the term disposition to signify the tendency a person has to act in a certain way, which is a matter of training. And training comes through practice. You learn to play the violin well by playing it, not by studying how to play it. You play. As usual, Aristotle's analysis of what's involved in habituation goes further than Plato. Talking of moral virtues, he says, we are constituted by nature to receive virtues, but the full development in us is due to habit. And in regard to particular virtues, this is an example, it is by refraining from pleasures that we become temperate or self-disciplined. And it is when we have become temperate that we're most able to abstain from pleasures. So there's a reaction and a backwards and forwards effect. Similarly with courage. You become courageous by training yourself in situations that test your courage. And once you've become courageous, then it becomes easier to perform those actions. Thirdly, there's an individual element to habituation. Since we all have different aptitudes, although we all share the same humanity. This is what makes Aristotle's ethics rather different from those moral philosophies which give universal rules for all human beings. You may have come across, or you may not, two kinds of moral rules for everybody. Utilitarians say that an action is good which maximizes the happiness of the maximum number of people. So that's a rule for every situation and every person. Or Kant says that reason itself, completely independent of both consequences and also one's own feelings and incentives, can determine the form of a good action. So these are two alternatives which give kind of certain rules about how to find out what a good action is. But Aristotle is different. Each person, for him, being different, has to aim slightly differently in order to do a virtuous action in some field or other. One has continually to assess the effects of one's actions and modify one's subsequent actions accordingly. And by this process of continual assessment of action and reaction, one will be habituating oneself to act in a certain way. One's disposition to act in that way will become more fixed. So now I'm going to go back to the question of how is it that one performs one's function as a human being, this issue that Aristotle raises halfway into Book 1. And this involves the three-part human soul. Aristotle here differs a little bit from Plato. Both of them have three parts to the soul, but Aristotle differs particularly in the way that he classifies the three parts of the soul in relation to nature. For Plato, the three parts are reason, spirit, and appetite, with different virtues associated either with each one: reason, wisdom; spirit, courage, and then self-discipline, and what's the fourth? The fourth is justice, of course, is involved in the whole. Yeah? But Aristotle's threefold human soul is reason, and then what he calls a deliberative or appetitive part of the soul, and then a vegetative part of the soul. And this relates to the difference he sees between plants, on the one hand, i.e. vegetation, which don't have feelings, animals, non-human animals, which need nutrition, so they're like plants, but are unlike plants in that they have feelings. And then humans need nutrition, have feelings, but they have reason as well. So these are in a hierarchy with reason at the top. And ultimately, if you go on to non-bodily beings like angels and gods, you go upwards to pure reason. So you've got the basis of a classification of nature that actually runs from 350 BC to 1850 AD. This runs through all of thinking about biology and creation. So if we're going to talk of happiness for a human being, you've got to think of what is distinctive for a human being. What is distinctive for a human being is the rational part of his soul. So we get a provisional definition of virtue, of what is good for man. Quotes, if the function of man is an activity of the soul in accordance with or implying a rational principle, and so on, and so on, and so on, we get a particular kind of virtue. You can read the definition. It goes on for several phrases, clauses. Okay, because of the three-part human soul, there are some human activities that involve pure reason and some that involve less pure reason or less of it. And this gives us a very important distinction that runs through the ethics and runs through our reading, and that is the distinction between intellectual excellence or virtues and moral excellence or virtues. Intellectual virtues we don't really come across. We use one particular intellectual virtue called prudence, but wisdom and understanding, both of these are intellectual excellences, which we in our readings this week don't read. It belongs to part of the ethics which we're not concerned with. We are concerned with the moral virtues, and the moral virtues are those that relate to the two upper parts of the human soul, feelings, the desiderative part, as well as reason. reason governs the feelings in some way. So, the division between moral virtues and intellectual virtues is fundamental. So now, with that background, we come to the provisional definition that he gives towards the end of Book 2 of what virtue is. And I'll read it, and then we'll dissect it into its different parts. And this particular definition is something that you can actually memorize, because once you've understood it, all the different parts of it, then you've understood Aristotle. So, virtue is a purposive disposition lying in a mean that is relative to us and determined by a rational principle and by that which a prudent man would use to determine it. So I'm going to go through the different parts. Virtue. I've already said that we're concerned with moral virtues, not intellectual virtues. Actions have to be guided, in a sense, by reason. Purposive. Virtue is a purposive disposition. Aristotle starts his book, The Ethics, with the following statement. Every art and every investigation, and similarly every action and pursuit, is considered to aim at some good or some end, some purpose. I.e., every action is purposive. He then goes on to ask whether there is a final end towards which all intermediate ends aim. And then to go further and say, if there is a final end, then it must be the supreme good. And then to ask what kind of thing that supreme good is, and to compare what Plato had said is supreme good to what he thinks, and there are quite big differences, but it gets into quite difficult territory of philosophy. But so I'm not going to go into that. And then he follows the argument to say what is good for man seems to be happiness, because happiness is something one achieves as an end in itself. One isn't happy in order to find some other goal. It's self-sufficient and complete. Happiness means living well and acting well. And from there, he goes to consider the function of man. He suddenly introduces this new theme of function in the middle of Book 1. And to say what the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, which we talked about. So purposive is a clue to why Aristotle gets into discussing happiness in the first place as an object of life at the beginning of his book on ethics, and why at the end of the book he comes back to the question of the highest form of happiness is actually closest to an activity of the god, which is contemplation. Virtue is a purposive disposition. We have already seen that a disposition is a characteristic response or tendency to do some action, the result of practice, experience, and habituation. Aristotle formulates the relation between disposition, that's the character of one's self, and action as follows. Like activities produce characteristics that determine the resulting dispositions. As I said earlier, you have to perform courageous actions in order to be courageous. Virtue is thus a disposition, a habitual response to do something well. It's not a feeling or a faculty. Feelings are involved, of course, but So this brings us to the definition, Aristotle's definition of what he means by the mean, which is one of the most famous things in Aristotle's ethics. When we are faced with a situation that demands action, we need to react with the correct balance, neither too strongly nor too weakly. If we react too strongly, we may be tempted to do the action too hard. And if our feeling is weak, then we may act too softly. We have to get the right balance in both action and feeling. Action and reaction have to be properly calibrated with just the right force. They must lie between two extremes, one of which of excess and the other of too little, of deficiency. This is what Aristotle calls the mean. Where exactly it lies, the mean lies in relation to the two ends, varies according to the different field of activity. For instance, in the field of fear and confidence, courage, which is the virtue, lies closer to the extreme of rashness than to the extreme of cowardness. While in the field of spending, probably it's better to be over-generous than stingy. So it varies according to the field. So this covers the first part of the next phrase, lying in a mean. Aristotle gives a table of the different virtues, showing the extremes, which are both of the extremes of vices, and the virtue lies in the middle. But not every action allows a mean. Some actions are so evil in themselves that they don't have extremes, they're just bad in themselves. So, virtue is a purposive disposition lying in a mean that is relative to us. I think probably you've got an idea of what that means already. Everybody requires something different. It's not the same for an athlete who's training for the marathon is going to eat something completely different than an old lady of 90. Each individual has to tune his or her action and feeling to what they know is their condition. In a quiz, I might have to keep a tight control over my temper, whereas somebody else who's cooler doesn't have to do it. Everybody has to react differently. Aristotle says, we must notice the errors into which we ourselves are liable to fall. I said at the beginning, we need to know ourselves in order to pursue Aristotle's idea of what good means, good action means. And we have to drag ourselves to the contrary direction. This is a good place to say how Aristotle uses the terms pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain, pleasure is not enjoying oneself, but it's the feeling that one gets out of doing something, and pain similarly. So he says that pleasure and pain are measures that you can use to assess how well you are getting on in habituating yourself to act in a certain way. If you feel pleasure at doing courageous things, then you're well on the way, he thinks, to perfecting for himself or herself the virtue of courage. Virtue is a purposive disposition lying in a mean that is relative to us and determined by a rational principle. Actions and feelings have to be determined by reason. Our reaction to a situation shouldn't be that of an animal without reason. Otherwise, we wouldn't be discussing human moral virtues at all. Animals do both act and feel, but they don't reason. And by that which a prudent man uses to determine it. So here we're getting into prudence, which is a way of looking ahead and calculating, assessing a situation. And that involves a little bit of intellectual virtue, one of the intellectual virtues. Not like wisdom, not like understanding, a bit like Odysseus' cunning intelligence. It means assessing something. And so it's that particular intellectual virtue that is involved in guiding reason to control one's action. Virtue is a purposive disposition lying in a mean that is relative to us and determined by a rational principle and by that which a prudent man would use to determine it. So, what kind of, well, you can discuss in class what kind of intelligence prudence is, but it involves choice. You have to deliberate about something and then choose a particular action. And in Book 3, which some of your teachers may include in the reading, some may not, Book 3 is largely about deliberation and choice. I'm not going to say anything more about that. So, virtue is a purposive disposition lying in a mean that is relative to us and determined by a rational principle and by that which a prudent man would use to determine it. So, now, I mean, that's a mouthful, and it's terribly dry. And I'm sorry to have to talk about theoretical stuff and practical stuff and so on, but it gives you an idea of what Aristotle is about. He's very, very systematic, and he thinks about, and people are taking Aristotle from this time right the way through, as I said, to 1850. At the end, he says, okay, you may not be able to understand my lecture notes, which is what his book really is. Set of lecture notes. Yeah? So, this is what he said. Yeah? It is possible, for example, to feel fear, confidence, desire, anger, pity, and pleasure and pain generally, too much or too little. And both of these are wrong. But to have these feelings at the right times, on the right grounds, towards the right people, for the right motive, and in the right way, is to feel them to an intermediate, that is, to the best degree. And this is the mark of virtue. Similarly, there are excess and deficiency and a mean in case of actions. But it is in the field of actions and feelings that virtue operates. That's Aristotle. Thank you for your attention.